tonight's story doesn't begin with a fight in the ring. It begins with a silence that felt louder than any knockout punch. Because when Claressa Shields, one of the most dominant, fearless athletes of her generation, steps into a moment and then allegedly walks away without a word, you already know something behind the scenes has reached a breaking point. But what exactly snapped? And why are people suddenly connecting her name to a situation involving Papoose and whispers of tension that no one seems willing to fully explain out loud? Let's be real, this isn't just another celebrity misunderstanding. This is a collision of reputations, loyalty, and ego. And according to those close to the situation, something was said, something small, maybe even quiet, that allegedly changed everything in a single moment. No dramatic confrontation. No viral argument, just a shift, a decision, and then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fade. It echoes, and here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because the reactions, the online chatter, the cryptic posts, they're not matching the public image these two have carefully built over the years. Claressa, known for her control and composure, suddenly at the center of a storm. Papoose, a man long associated with loyalty and stability, now being pulled into speculation that's spreading faster than anyone can control. So what really happened in that room? And why does it feel like the story we're seeing is only a fraction of something much bigger? Because if even half of these whispers are true, then what came next didn't just shock the fans. It changed the entire narrative. The situation didn't start with a headline. It started with a pattern. And once you start looking closely, you realize this wasn't some random burst of drama. It was something that had been building for a while, quietly behind closed doors, long before anyone online even suspected a crack. Claressa Shields didn't just wake up one day and explode. According to the way this story is unfolding, something had been simmering beneath the surface. Something that finally reached a point where silence was no longer an option. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand the weight both names carry. Claressa Shields isn't just another athlete in the conversation. She's a two-time Olympic gold medalist, multiple weight world champion, and one of the most dominant forces in combat sports history. Her entire career has been built on controlled aggression in the ring, controlled presence outside of it. She doesn't move impulsively. She calculates. She waits. She executes. So when someone like that is suddenly at the center of emotional tension, it doesn't feel random. It feels intentional, or worse, inevitable. And then there's Papoose, a man who has spent years building a reputation around loyalty, consistency, and composure. In an industry where relationships collapse publicly every other week, he positioned himself as the exception, the one who stayed, the one who didn't fold, the one who stood firm no matter what. That image matters. It's part of his identity. And that's exactly why this situation is landing so hard for people paying attention, because now you've got two people, both known for control, both known for stability in their own ways, suddenly tied to a moment that allegedly didn't go the way anyone expected. And here's where the tone of this entire situation shifts. Because according to those allegedly familiar with the timeline, this didn't explode in a loud, chaotic way. There were no public arguments, no viral shouting matches, no dramatic confrontation caught on camera. Instead, what people are describing is something far more unsettling, something quieter, a conversation, a pause, a shift in energy that everyone in the room allegedly felt but couldn't quite interrupt. And that's the part people are struggling to process. Because in situations like this, people expect fireworks. They expect a breakdown. They expect something they can point to and say, that's when it happened. But instead, what's being described is the opposite. A slow build, a moment where words were exchanged, not loudly, not aggressively, but in a way that apparently carried weight for beyond what was actually said. And then, the moment that's being talked about the most, Claressa allegedly standing up and walking away. No shouting, no argument, no dramatic exit speech, just a decision. And if you understand anything about Claressa Shields, you understand that walking away isn't something she does lightly. This is someone who stands in the center of pressure for a living. Someone who has been tested physically, mentally, and emotionally at the highest levels. So, when she chooses to leave a situation without engaging further, that tells you everything you need to know about how that moment felt to her. But the real question is, why? What was said? What shifted? What reached a point where continuing the conversation no longer made sense? And this is where the speculation begins to take over. Because once the moment happened, everything that followed started to get dissected. Every social media post, every subtle change in tone, every quiet reaction that didn't quite match what people expected. People started pointing to timing, changes in online activity, the shift from shared energy to individual focus. The kind of details most people wouldn't notice unless they were actively looking for a story to connect dots. And once people start connecting dots, whether those dots are real or imagined, the narrative begins to take shape on its own. Some claim there were underlying tensions long before this moment. Conversations that didn't fully resolve. Questions that were asked but not fully answered. According to these claims, this wasn't a sudden disagreement, it was the result of multiple smaller moments that built up over time. Each one adding a little more pressure until something finally gave. Others suggest that what happened wasn't necessarily about a single issue, but about tone, energy, the feeling that something wasn't being said directly, even when conversations were happening. And if there's one thing that can cause tension in any relationship, it's the gap between what is said and what is meant. But what makes this situation different from typical celebrity drama is the way it ended, because there was no escalation. No back and forth, just a moment, followed by a decision, followed by silence. And that silence is doing something very specific in this story. It's giving space for interpretation. And when there's space for interpretation, the narrative doesn't stay controlled for long. Almost immediately, reactions started forming. People began choosing sides without even having a full picture. Some defended Claressa, pointing to her history of discipline and emotional control, suggesting that if she walked away, it must have been for a serious reason. Others defended Papoose, emphasizing his long-standing reputation for loyalty and calm, arguing that something about the situation isn't being fully understood from the outside. And then, of course, came the speculation, because once a situation becomes public, it stops being just about the people involved, it becomes entertainment. And in entertainment, people don't just watch. They analyze, they interpret, and sometimes they exaggerate. Posts started circulating. Old clips started resurfacing. Every interaction between the two that could possibly be reinterpreted suddenly was. That's the reality of modern attention. Nothing stays in context for long, and in the middle of all this noise, the most important detail remains the least understood. What actually triggered that moment in the room? Because according to the version of events being circulated, this wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't something that just happened. It was something that reached a tipping point, and whatever that tipping point was, it didn't require yelling. It didn't require confrontation. It just required a moment of clarity, followed by a decision, and Claressa Shields allegedly made hers. But what people aren't fully prepared for is the idea that this moment might not be the end of the story. Because in situations like this, what happens in the aftermath can sometimes be even more important than what happened in the moment itself. And right now, the aftermath is where the real tension is building. Because once a door has been closed like that, once a moment like that happens, there are only a few ways this story can go from here. And none of them are simple. And this is where the story starts to stretch beyond a single moment. Because once something like that happens, the silence doesn't stay empty for long. It starts getting filled with interpretations, with assumptions, and with people trying to piece together a version of events that makes sense from the outside. But the more you look at it, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just about one conversation. It's about everything leading up to it. According to the narrative that's been circulating, there were subtle signals before the walkout, small shifts that, at the time, might have looked insignificant, but now feel like clues. Changes in tone during public appearances, a different energy in how interactions were presented, moments that felt slightly off if you were paying close attention. And while none of these things individually prove anything, together they start forming a pattern, and patterns are what people latch onto when answers are missing. Claressa Shields, as a personality, has always been known for being direct. In the ring, she doesn't hesitate. She doesn't second guess. She commits to every move. So when people hear that she allegedly reached a point where she chose to disengage completely instead of confronting the situation further, it raises questions because for someone like her, walking away isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign that something crossed a line she wasn't willing to entertain. Now, on the other side of this narrative, Papoose's reputation becomes part of the conversation in a very different way. For years, he's been associated with stability. The kind of man who doesn't react impulsively, who doesn't lose control, who holds things together even when the pressure builds. That's the image the public has of him. But now, people are re-examining that image through the lens of this situation, and that's where things get complicated because depending on which version of events you listen to, this could either be a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, or a moment where something deeper was exposed. Some sources suggest that the conversation in that room wasn't just casual, it was direct. Not aggressive, but intentional. The kind of conversation where questions are asked that require real answers, not rehearsed responses. And when those answers don't satisfy the person asking, tension begins to build. And that tension, according to the way this story is being described, didn't explode, it compressed until it couldn't anymore. And then came the moment everyone keeps referring to, the moment where Claressa allegedly stood up and left. No shouting. No confrontation. Just movement. And in a situation like that, movement says more than words ever could, because when someone leaves without engaging further, it sends a very specific message. The conversation has reached its limit. There's nothing left to negotiate in that moment. Whatever needed to be said has already been said, or more accurately, felt, and that's where public reaction begins to split. Some people are calling it a power move, a quiet but strong decision that reflects emotional intelligence and self-respect. Others are viewing it as a sign that something serious was being avoided or left unresolved. But the truth is, without direct confirmation from either side, everything remains interpretation, and interpretation is where things get messy, because once the moment was over, the aftermath began almost immediately. Social media became the first battlefield. Posts were analyzed, deleted content was scrutinized, and every subtle shift in tone was picked apart by people trying to decode meaning where there might not have been any intended. Then came the indirect reactions, cryptic messages, vague statements, and posts that seemed to reference something without ever directly naming it, and that's where the situation becomes more layered. Because instead of clarity, you get fragments, and fragments invite speculation. Some of the commentary started pointing toward emotional distance, suggesting that whatever the relationship dynamic was, it may have been shifting over time without being fully addressed. Others focused on the idea of public versus private reality, the difference between how things appear and how they actually feel behind closed doors. And when those two worlds don't align, tension is inevitable. There are also claims, again, unverified, that what happened in that room wasn't just about one issue, but about a series of unspoken concerns that had been building, things that weren't fully addressed. Conversations that may have been started but never completed, and when that happens, every small moment starts carrying more weight than it should. A simple sentence can feel heavier, a pause can feel longer, a look can feel like a statement. And eventually, something gives. But here's where things take an interesting turn in the narrative, because after the walkout, there was no immediate public explanation, no detailed statement breaking down what happened, no attempt to clarify the situation right away. Instead, there was silence, and that silence is what's fueling most of the speculation, because when people don't explain themselves, Others step in to fill the gaps. Some believe this silence is strategic and intentional decision to avoid feeding the narrative and let things settle naturally. Others interpret it as a sign that the situation is more complicated than what can be publicly addressed. Meanwhile, Papoose's reaction or lack of a visible reaction is also being analyzed. People are questioning whether his response, or absence of one, says something about how the situation was handled internally. Some point to restraint as a strength, while others see the lack of a clear public stance as adding more questions than answers. And this is where the tension really starts to build, because the longer there's no direct explanation, the more the story evolves on its own. New theories emerge. Old clips get recontextualized, and what started as a single moment in a room begins to expand into something much larger in the public eye now. Whether or not the more dramatic claims are true, the impact is already real. Because both individuals are now at the center of a conversation that's bigger than them. It's about perception. It's about image, and it's about how quickly narratives can shift when something unexpected happens. And in this case, the unexpected wasn't loud. It was quiet. But sometimes the quiet moments are the ones that leave the biggest impact, because they don't just end a conversation, they start a much bigger one. And as more people continue to weigh in, analyze, and speculate, one thing becomes clear. This story is still unfolding, and whatever comes next is going to determine whether this moment stays a quiet turning point or becomes something much bigger than anyone initially expected. And this is where everything tightens again. Because once a story reaches this level of public attention, it stops being just about what happened in that room and starts becoming about what happens next. Every move, every silence, every post or lack of it suddenly carries weight. And in this case, the weight is heavier than usual because people aren't just watching. They're waiting for someone to speak. Waiting for someone to break the silence, waiting for something definitive to confirm or completely dismantle the narrative that's been building piece by piece. But here's the thing: when a situation reaches this stage, the silence itself becomes part of the story. And right now, that silence is loud. Because no matter which side you look at, there's no clear resolution, no clean explanation, no single statement that ties everything together. Instead, there are fragments, observations, interpretations, and a growing sense that whatever happened is not something that can be summarized in a simple sentence according to the ongoing narrative. Both Claressa Shields and Papoose are now navigating the aftermath in very different ways. On one side, there's Claressa, an athlete whose entire career has been built on discipline and focus. People who follow her closely know that when she makes a decision, it's not impulsive, it's calculated, it's deliberate. So, the idea that she would walk away from a situation without a second thought doesn't really align with how she's known to operate, which leads people to believe that the decision to leave that room was not emotional in the way some might assume. It was intentional. A boundary, a line drawn in real time, and once a boundary like that is set, it changes everything, because it doesn't just end a moment, it redefines it. Now, on the other side, Papoose is being viewed through a different lens entirely. For years, he's been associated with consistency, with loyalty, with being the kind of person who doesn't fold under pressure. But in this moment, people are questioning what that consistency looks like when faced with a situation that apparently didn't resolve in the expected way. And the reactions to this have been divided, to say the least. Some people are defending both sides, saying this is simply a private matter that got pulled into the public eye. Others are analyzing every possible angle, trying to determine who said what, who reacted how, and what might have triggered the shift that led to the walkout. And then there are the people in the middle, the ones who aren't choosing sides, but are instead focused on one thing: what actually happened? Because without a clear answer, everything remains speculation, and speculation is where narratives either grow or fall apart. There are claims floating around that suggest there was more than just a disagreement, that the conversation in that room touched on deeper issues that weren't fully addressed, or perhaps weren't fully understood at the time. According to these claims, the tension didn't come from a single moment, but from a buildup of smaller moments that eventually reached a breaking point. But again, none of this has been confirmed. And that's important because in the absence of confirmation, everything remains theory. However, what is confirmed is the impact. Because even without a full explanation, the public reaction has already taken shape. People are talking, people are debating, and people are watching both individuals very closely. In situations like this, perception becomes just as powerful as reality. If people perceive something as serious, it becomes serious in the public eye regardless of what the actual details may be. And that's where the challenge lies, because once a narrative starts to form, it becomes difficult to control. Every new piece of information, whether real or speculative, gets added to the existing story. And over time, that story can evolve into something much larger than the original event. Right now, the question isn't just about what happened in that room. It's about what happens next. Will there be a statement? Will there be clarification? Will one of them address the situation directly and provide context that reshapes everything we think we know? Or will the silence continue, allowing the story to grow in the absence of confirmation? Because that's the other possibility. Sometimes, in high-profile situations like this, silence is strategic. Not because there is nothing to say, but because saying the wrong thing can make the situation worse. So instead, people wait. They observe. They choose their moment carefully. And that waiting game adds another layer of tension, because the longer there's no official explanation, the more people fill in the blanks themselves, and those blanks can become loud. But here's where the story takes a slightly different turn, because while the public continues to speculate, the individuals involved are the only ones who truly know what happened in that room, and that's something that can't be replaced. No amount of commentary. No amount of analysis. No amount of speculation can fully capture the reality of that moment unless one of them decides to explain it directly. Until then, everything remains open to interpretation. And that's why this story isn't over. In fact, it feels like it's still unfolding, because in situations like this, the real ending doesn't come when the moment happens. It comes when someone finally decides to speak, and when that happens, everything changes. Until then, the questions remain. What really triggered the walkout? What was said that shifted the energy so drastically? And why does it feel like there's something still being left unsaid? Because the truth is, sometimes the most important part of a story isn't what happens in the moment. It's what comes after. And in this case, what comes after is still being written, and just like that, we reach the point where the story stops being something you just watch and starts becoming something you can't ignore. Because the questions aren't going away, the tension isn't fading, and the silence? That's only making everything feel even heavier. So now, the real question is, what do you believe actually happened behind that door? Was it a moment that simply got misunderstood and blown out of proportion? Or was it something deeper? Something that changed everything in ways we're only beginning to understand? Because here's the truth, nobody is saying out loud stories like this don't just disappear. They evolve, they grow. And sometimes, the real details don't come from headlines. They come later, when the pressure builds and the truth can't stay hidden anymore. And when that moment comes, you already know this is where it gets revealed first. So if you're following this story, stay locked in. Because what comes next might change everything. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want the full story as it develops. And tell me in the comments, do you think this was just drama? Or the beginning of something much bigger?